All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're doing great out there. In this video, I'm gonna talk a bit about Plato's Meno. So we've covered the Euthyphro from Plato, which is traditionally understood as a Socratic dialogue, meaning that it's a dialogue that is trying to tell us something about Socrates, the man, the myth, the legend, right, the philosopher, the person who um, was indicted for impiety and corrupting the youth um, in ancient Athens. We learn about the Socratic method, and we learn about a whole host of other things that we've talked about that have a connection to um, doing philosophy, um, and perhaps even beyond in this day and age. So the relevance of the Plato's Youth, its legacy is quite significant. No, I think with Plato's Meno, we turn to a dialogue where I think there's a bit more of Plato trying to show us um, who Socrates was to some degree, but I think we start seeing um, Plato trying to use Socrates as a mouthpiece for maybe exploring other ways of doing philosophy, maybe going a bit beyond the Socratic method, as we'll see. So I want to just call in initial attention to that point as we dive into the text. We're going to see some similarity between Plato's Meno and the Euthyphro, at least at the beginning, where there's a conversation about the nature or the essence of virtue. And we're going to see Meno, the main conversation partner of Socrates in the dialogue, offer answers to the question, what is virtue? And we're going to see Socrates dismantle those definitions, and we're going to see other things happen after that. So it's going to be different from the Euthyphro in the sense that it's not going to be dominated by definitions being offered, but other things are going to happen as well. I think those things that happen, those quote unquote other things, are significant to understanding the way in which Plato's sort of evolving as either as a thinker or a writer or as someone who's doing philosophy, as he's attempting to go beyond, or at least more beyond capturing who Socrates was. Again, as a philosopher, as a man, as someone in trouble in ancient Athens, etc. So, likely most of you know, if you don't, this is a spoiler alert. Um, Socrates, he's portrayed as someone who gets indicted for impiety, not believing what the gods believe, and corrupting the youth by teaching the youth falsities about the gods. So it was claimed that Socrates um, believed that the gods didn't fight in war with each other, disagree with each other, and these kinds of things. But Athenian theology is pretty clear that the gods did. So these are kind of heretical ideas. In a work called The Apology by Plato, so it's Plato's Apology, it's Socrates' defense. So it's a literary work capturing Socrates' defense against these criminal charges in Athens. Um, it's claimed in that text that Socrates is an atheist and he corrupts the youth by teaching them some version of atheism. And then, well, he ends up getting the death penalty as a result. It has to drink some hemlock and commit suicide, which we learned in a subsequent dialogue known as the Phaedo, another one by Plato, where Socrates is the main character. It's his deathbed classic or a jail cell classic, where Socrates is in prison in Athens and is living sort of his last hours alive and having a philosophical conversation with his friends, where he's um, attempting to argue things like uh, his death isn't bad for him because he's being freed from his body in order um, to do more philosophy, if I can put it that way. Um, Plato explores the idea through Socrates in that text of philosophy as a kind of practicing dying, a practice that culminates in death, right? Which is the unimprisonment of the de-imprisonment of the soul from the body, so the soul can actually now focus on philosophical matters more thoroughly without being interrupted by sensual experiences, by sense experiences and the like. So, so Plato's Meno is one of these texts where it's kind of in between um, Socrates' you might say having been um, indicted by Miletus as the main witness against him, as is depicted in Euthyphro, and also Plato's Apology, as it turns out, and Socrates is being found guilty and then being sent to prison in Athens. So Meno is kind of this interesting text. We're not quite sure when it happens, but it does seem, based on some passages in the text, as if um, um, Socrates is. It's known that Socrates is in some kind of trouble in Athens, or will be in some kind of trouble, and so we know that that's what's going on. So this is, you might say, um, something like chronologically, it's kind of closer to the Apology, or so closer to the Euthyphro than the Phaedo in terms of it, if laying out a timeline, at least one that Plato gives us. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful, but we have to sort of pick up some clues from the text because we're not told explicitly. So our focus from the meeting will be on virtue and knowledge, and a couple other topics as well, but those will be the topics that dominate our discussion. So let's go to the text real quick. So these intros are nice, so I recommend reading those so you don't get too lost when trying to find out what's happening when you're reading the text. But you see the text kind of just begins here. I'm on page 59. Meno, it says, "Can you tell me, Socrates, that can virtue be taught, or is it not teachable but the result of practice? Or is it neither of these? Um, but men have it by nature, man and woman have it by nature in some other way." Okay, there's a launch into a philosophical conversation without sort of the initial buildup that we often see in other Socratic dialogues. It might tell us something interesting is happening, um, but it's unclear exactly if that's true. And then we learn who Meno is. He's a Thessalonian, or Thessalian, as uh, depicted here. And he's visiting ancient Athens. He's staying with a man named Enitis, as it turns out. And Enitis is one of Socrates' accusers at his trial. So that's an interesting point that the text reveals to us here, and then in the Apology. So Socrates' response basically is, well, I can't tell you virtue can be taught because I don't know what virtue is, meaning I don't know what the essence of virtue is. Okay. And he says he doesn't know anybody who knows what the essence of virtue is. And then Meno quickly says, well, you're kind of offending me because I know what virtue is. I've been taught virtue by my teacher, Gorgias. There's the name Gorgias here at the bottom of the page. What page? 159. Okay, Gorgias. So then Socrates is like, I apologize, and let's figure out what virtue is together. And here on the bottom of page 60, we get the first definition. It's not hard to tell you, Socrates. First, if you want the virtue of a man, it's easy to see that a man's virtue consists of being able to manage public affairs, and in doing so to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and to be careful that no harm comes to himself. So, roughly speaking, the first definition in part is, well, a man managing public affairs well. And then for a woman, he says, top page 61, it's not difficult to describe. She must manage the home well. Okay, don't shoot the messenger. This is a text from the ancient Greek tradition. Um, preserve its possessions and be submissive to her husband. And the virtue of a child, whether male or female, is different again. And so is that of an elderly man, if you want that, or if you want that of a free man or slave. Okay, so again, talking about an ancient Athenian period, slavery was for most, if not all, really not even a second thought. Slavery was just so ingrained part of the culture that here it shows up in the text without anyone blinking. Okay. Not that slavery doesn't persist now, but at least a significant amount of slavery persists now, given the number of people who are part of the slave trade. um, trafficking or otherwise, but we're deeply opposed to it, and we blink an eye at it. We want it to we want to try to eradicate it. But both Socrates and Meno, at least tacitly, Socrates at least implicitly, right? Tacitly and implicitly, I mean, there's no like external challenge or explicit challenge to the claim that slaves could be virtuous. But that seems to that's what Meno's saying, and it seems like Socrates is fine accepting it, at least for the sake of argument. So we can have man, woman, we can have child, we can have elderly, we can have a free man or a slave. And the virtue of those, or when we define virtue, these are all ways of being virtuous. He says there's virtue for every, Meno says there's virtue for every action and every age, for every task of ours, and every one of us. And Socrates, the same is true for the opposite of virtue, namely wickedness or vice. Okay, so then here, let's go back. So we know the initial question is, can virtue be taught? Initial significance of that is, well, if virtue can't be taught, then it would seem as if we're just virtue by nature. But are we really virtuous by nature? Doesn't seem like we are. We might be good by nature in some sense, but that doesn't mean that we're excellent at, thinking and acting, with feeling, responding with our spirit feelings to the world, right? These are things that we like have to in their entirety acquire, even if we're given good head starts by our genetics and our environment. Okay, so that's one reason why that initial question is important, is because if virtue can't be taught, then, well, given that we're not innately virtuous, right, meaning that we're not born virtuous, then we'd have to have some other way of accounting for our becoming virtuous. And if you read the text to its entirety, by the time you get to the end, you see the relevance of this. So there's that initial question, which ends up having relevance later on. So we'll come back to that point. Okay, and I've given you a bit of a sneak preview as to kind of think about the importance of the question, and we'll come back to it. So Socrates' response is, I don't know the essence of virtue. Fine. Then let's get on the project of defining virtue. Meno says he was taught what virtue is from his teacher Gorgias, and so he's going to define what it is. We know what this question means. What is the essence of virtue? So what's the universal characteristic that every virtuous thing has in common? Okay, whether it's an action, a virtuous action, a virtuous state of the soul, or some such. Okay. Well, so Meno's first definition for a man, we talked about it for women. It's another thing. For a child, it's another. For a slave, it's another. For the elderly, it's another. For a free man, it's another. So Socrates is responsible. These are just examples, because we still don't know what universal feature these examples of being virtuous have in common. So these are types of virtue, but like presumably there's something that these types of virtue would have in common that explain their being virtuous. So Socrates, like this, just a list of examples. So very similar to this is very similar to what Socrates did to Euthyphro, right? When Euthyphro gives an example in at the beginning of his discussion of what the essence of piety is. So remember there, Socrates says, "What's the essence of piety?" Euthyphro says, "It's doing what I'm doing, prosecuting wrongdoers," and things like this. Okay, and Socrates, and of course we also discuss this in our video lectures. Socrates says that's just an example. Why is that an example? Why does that count as something that is a pious in the first place? Well, the same thing would hold here. It's just now we have like a list of examples, not just one thing and then things like that are mentioned, but a list of things. So Socrates isn't looking for a definition that's going to provide an example or two or three or four or five or even all of them, every possible one of them. He's looking for he's looking for the feature that something that's virtuous has, something that being virtuous has that explains why it's virtuous in the first place. Okay, so this is something that we're probably readily familiar with and maybe quite expert at now. We know Socrates looking for, okay, in a definition. So Meno's second definition, so he's game for the task. So I have it as 2A here. So there'll be a 2A and a 2B, I believe. I don't think 2A, 2B, yeah, just 2A and 2B. So if you're taking notes, I just wanted to mention that. So what is virtue? That's still the question. What's the essence of virtue? Well, virtue, Meno says, is if one universal thing is needed, well, it's having the power to rule over others. Go back to the Meno here. Um, it's interesting because Socrates, in trying to exp explain to Meno what he's looking for in a definition, a Socratic definition, a real definition, he gives the example of be. Suppose you start list. So suppose Socrates is looking for the essence of be, and someone just starts listing off all the different kinds of bees. Well, what is it that explains that they're bees in the first place? Why do those things make the list? And that's what Socrates would be looking for. So that's kind of a cool example to use. But then here we're on page 62, and maybe 3/4 of the way down, here at 73D with the pagination, the numbering and lettering on the sides, the Stephanus numbering and lettering. Meno says, what else but to be able to rule over people? If you're seeking one description to fit them all, one universal characteristic to fit everything that counts as virtuous. That's how we derive 2a here, that having the power to rule over others. Socrates says this is too exclusive in a way, but it's also too inclusive. So it's too exclusive because it's going to rule out kids and slaves counting as virtuous. Why? Because, well, they don't have the power to rule over others. Kids don't, just because they're kids, and slaves don't have the power to do so because, well, they're slaves, right? They're basically absolutely controlled by some slave owner, some other person. Okay, so so it looks like this definition is going to fail for being too exclusive, but also too inclusive, right? So it's this isn't contradictory because it'll be too inclusive in a way, but too exclusive in another way. So the way it's too inclusive is that it will include too many things that aren't virtuous. So it'll include using power, having power to rule over others in an unjust way. Okay, so nothing about having the power to rule over others entails that power is used, or having that power is used in a just way. But of course, we think that if if um, if having that power to rule over others unjustly is consistent with 2a, then this definition overgeneralizes, right? It includes things that count as virtuous, which aren't. So let's say it's too inclusive, right? So any definition of virtue can't include something that we would consider to be not virtuous or wicked or vicious, right? The opposite of virtue. Um, so hopefully we understand that. This will come back. So that's why I'm taking the time to discuss it in some detail. So suppose then we try to avoid the definition being too inclusive and we revise it to be. So virtue is now having the power to rule over others justly, not unjustly. So now we can say that the definition to be here is consistent with having the power to rule over others unjustly. Why? Because we just build the negation of that into the definition. So Socrates' response here is that now we just have an example of virtue, not the essence thereof. How is this just an example? Well, if we start listing off the things that are virtuous, well, having the power to rule over others in a just and not unjust way will count as just one way of being virtuous. And maybe an easy way of seeing this is, virtue is also presumably having the power to rule over others courageously and not uncourageously, or honorably and not dishonorably. Okay, so this would just be one example of virtue, not the essence thereof. So we try to fix 2a by running 2b, but we end up with a different kind of problem. Okay, we end up with just an example. So now the third definition, Meno has to scrap his definition, so he tries another one. The third definition, I think we'll have a 3a, b, and 3a and b. Okay, again. And this one's interesting because it's the first of its kind for us in terms of our studying Socrates, Plato, is we have an and sentence. So we have a sentence which we call logically a conjunction, where each of the parts of a conjunction is a conjunct. And so we have to evaluate both conjuncts. So it's an and sentence, it's a conjunction. So we have to think about the logic of a conjunction. And there, in order for a conjunction to be true, well, both of its parts have to be true. So, easy example, if I say, um, I'm teaching at 2 o'clock today, and I'll have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich after class today. That sentence, that conjunction, that complex conjunction, is true only if both of its parts are true. So if either part is false, the sentence is false, as we say. Okay. So if again, my sentence is I'm teaching at 2 o'clock today, and I'll have a PB&J after class. And PB&J lovers out there, okay. Hopefully there's many of you. We all stand together. Um, um, in order for that sentence to be true, of course, well, then I have to teach at 2 o'clock today, which I do. It's technically 2:10, but work with me. And then, I'll have a PB&J after class, which I will. But of course, I haven't had it yet. But in order for that sentence to be true, well, both parts have to be satisfied. So if I end up not having a PB&J after class, then doesn't it follow that what I've said is false? Okay, not that I was lying, but just that what I said is false, because not all expressions of falsehood count as lies. So I didn't intend to lie. It's just that it may turn out that, I intend to have the PB&J, but I get home and my wife has prepared for me a delicious curry or something. Well, I'm gonna have the curry, the hot curry, with rice over the PB&J. Okay, so anyways, that could happen. So hopefully that point is clear. As we're going to see there, Socrates will take exception with both of the conjuncts here. So think about this and sentences. Logically, we call these conjunctions, and each part of a conjunction is a conjunct. So we have this is conjunct one. Okay, virtue is desiring beautiful things, and virtue is having the power to obtain those beautiful things. Okay. So that'd be important to note. If you have any questions about the logic of that, let me know, so that way I can help out with your studying the material on this. I know sometimes when you first learn it, it can be a little tricky to learn this new vocabulary, but I think you understand the underlying logic. Why? Because you're a Cal Poly student and you're really smart. But if there are any issues, even just the way I'm presenting it, maybe the example wasn't good enough, whatever, let me know. I'm happy to help out with giving better examples and getting you on the right page. I think part of what I try to do when I teach is try to give you little doses of logic along the way, because that'll go a long way in your critical thinking, right? Your ability to think carefully about ideas that you see presented to you, not just here but elsewhere. It kind of has like a um, uh, um, what's the word I'm looking for? It has a kind of um, residual effect, in the sense that you read it, you get taught it, and then you start putting it into practice. Okay, kind of naturally. Um, okay, um, maybe it's osmosis. No, okay, it's probably not that, but you know what I mean, right? Maybe an osmotic effect, as some people try to say. Like I knew someone once who said that she left a book on the books that she was studying on the side of the bed, because the book's ideas would make their way into her unconscious, which would then shape her thinking. Okay, now I'll set aside whether or not that's true. I'll let you think about that one, but that's not what I was going for. Okay, so what's going on here? We move from 3A to 3B in a hurry. How so? Well, the long and short of it is that Socrates asks Meno whether beautiful things are good things, and Meno says yes. So then we move from 3A to 3B. Likely a strategic move by Socrates, okay, to get this move, to get this definition instead of 3A. Okay, this is in line with many people's belief that um, truth, beauty, and goodness are intimately connected things. Okay, there are ways in which they're similar, maybe ways in which they're different as well, but they're very similar. So that's the long and short of it. We can talk more about that as needed if you have trouble with that in the text, but pretty straightforward. Are beautiful things good things? Yes. Okay, good. Then we can go ahead and substitute good for beautiful. So 3B, the definition of of virtue that Meno's offering here is that virtue is desiring good things and having the power to obtain those things. Okay. And Socrates is say that both parts of 3B fail. Okay. And given the intimate connection between beauty and goodness, both parts of 3A would fail. But once we move to 3B, we're going down that rabbit hole. Okay. So how do we show that both parts of 3B fail? We show that virtue is not desiring good things, and virtues not having the power to obtain them, obtain those good things. So 3b, again, this is just the definition from the previous slide. And here, 3b subscript 1, 3b1 is just dealing with that first conjunct. You see? Virtues in part, desiring good things. I build this in part because given that we have a conjunction or a conjunctive definition, we have two parts that come together to make a whole, which as a whole are virtue. Okay, or as a whole is virtue. Get my grammar right there. So so Socrates is going to claim that virtue isn't in part desiring good things because um, uh, because if it were, then we would by our very natures be in part virtuous or partly virtuous. That sounds a bit cleaner to put it that way. Why? Because Socrates and Meno agree that we just by our nature or innately, or we are born with the desires whenever they get activated to, guess what? Desire good things. So if virtue is in part desiring good things, then we would be in part virtuous, just by our nature, innately. But that's wrong, Socrates claims, because you might say virtue in its entirety is an achievement. So here's the slogan to help us understand this bit here, to understand Socrates' response to the first part of Meno's third definition, 3b1 here. It's that virtue in its entirety is an achievement, or virtue is wholly, WHOLLY, an achievement. Okay, that's a slogan to guide us. Now, why think that's true? Well, because it doesn't seem like anybody's born with excellent thinking, excellent feeling, excellent actions. These are things that we have to work on. Okay. Like our experience seems to teach us this. Okay. Small children have to work really hard to develop their reason to think well, and they have to spend a lot of time maturing to control their feelings. And people have to, small children have to work really hard to perform the right actions. Okay. In fact, you might say that that's something we kind of work on our whole lives. Okay. But we see it especially in children, don't we? But I'm in the camp of thinkers who would say that these are things that we work on our whole lives, but they're achievements in some sense. Okay. Okay. So that's why 3b1 fails. Okay. So keep in mind that slogan that I taught you, and hopefully it'll help you here. What about the second conjunct here, having the power to obtain good things? Well, you can guess what the problems here's going to be, right? So we'll call this 3b2. This is the second part of this conjunctive definition. This is just too inclusive. Why? Because someone could have the power to obtain good things in an unjust way, so we'd have to rule that out. We'd have to do that by revising our definition to 3c. Virtues apart, having the power to obtain good things justly, not unjustly. Okay, but now we just have an example. Okay, so as I note here, this is too inclusive. Unjust uses of power to obtain good things are no part of virtue. Moreover, if we modify the definition to exclude unjust uses of power, we are left with just another example of virtue. Okay, so we've already dealt with this one when we dealt with this one, right? 2a. So it looks like the definition's in trouble. 2a and 2b really, right? Because just the emphasis on the 2a part, but the 2b part counts as well. I mean, we're thinking about how we can try to modify the definition, but then we just end up with an example again. Okay, and not the essence of virtue. Okay, now at this point, Meno gets upset at Socrates and says all kinds of mean things to Socrates, like he's a broad torpedo fish. Can you fathom it? We'll talk about this more in my next video. I'll pick up here next time. So this video I wanted to do was brief introduction to the dialogue, flag the fact that there's going to be some interesting things that happen with Plato, the philosopher, in this dialogue, at least what I want to emphasize, and then talk about the definitions of virtue. But then we'll talk about the significance of the fact that the dialogue moves away from that for a bit. And I think this is a signaling of something new developing in Plato's thinking. We're not just going to do the definition response, the definition offering and then definition critique thing, okay, and then end without an answer to the thing we're trying to define. We're going to do something different this time. Okay, so we'll get to that, but this is the last video of the week that I'll post. So there's that, and then be on the lookout for more Meno next week. We'll pick up with Meno being upset at Socrates. Meno thought he knew what virtue was, but Socrates, right, has him struggling here a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. I'll wish you all well. Be in touch with any questions that you have. I'm happy to converse with you. Check out the discussion that I posted. On Canvas. If you're interested in contributing to that, I'll be moving on to another topic soon. So if you want to chime in and get in on that, let's do it. If not, take care. Have a great one.